The morning sun cast golden threads through the lace curtains of Emma Thornton's childhood bedroom, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the air. She sat before the Victorian mirror, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened her grandmother's pearl necklace, the same one worn at 3 generations of Thornton weddings. Outside, the village of Bourton-on-the-Water was already stirring, its ancient stone bridges reflecting in the crystal-clear waters of the Windrush. "You look absolutely radiant, darling," her mother whispered, adjusting the delicate veil that had been carefully preserved for 30 years. Emma's reflection smiled back, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of intuition that she quickly dismissed. Today was meant to be perfect. Across the village, in the Hartwell cottage that overlooked the church, Margaret Hartwell stood, frozen, in her son's empty room. James had left early for the church, his excitement palpable. But Margaret's hands clutched a yellowed envelope she'd discovered just 3 days ago, hidden beneath old photograph albums in the attic. The contents had stolen her sleep, her appetite, her peace. The paper inside bore a truth so devastating that her chest physically ached with the weight of it. She remembered the moment she'd found it, how her legs had given way, how she'd sat among the dusty boxes sobbing silently, praying it was some terrible mistake. But the evidence was undeniable. The medical records, the DNA test from a private clinic dated 22 years ago, and a letter in her late husband's handwriting that began with, "My dearest Margaret, by the time you read this," the church bells began their jubilant peal, and Margaret knew she had to move. She slipped the envelope into her handbag, her reflection in the hallway mirror showing a woman aged 10 years in 3 days. The navy dress she'd chosen months ago with such joy now felt like mourning attire. How could she watch her son marry Emma when she knew what she knew? How could she not? Emma's sister Sarah burst through the door, her bridesmaid dress swishing with excitement. "The cars are here. Everyone's already gathering at the church. Mrs. Hartwell just arrived. She looks a bit pale, but who wouldn't be emotional today?" If only Sarah knew that Margaret's pallor came not from joy, but from carrying a secret that would shatter 2 families' hearts. As Emma rose, smoothing her dress one final time, she caught a glimpse of James's mother through the window. Margaret stood at the church entrance, her silhouette rigid against the ancient stones. Even from this distance, Emma could sense something was terribly wrong. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and in that moment, Margaret's facade cracked just enough for Emma to see the anguish beneath. "Ready, my love?" Emma's father appeared in the doorway, his arms open. She nodded, pushing down the sudden chill that ran through her. Whatever was troubling Margaret would have to wait until after the ceremony. The interior of St. Lawrence Church had never looked more magnificent. White roses and baby's breath adorned every pew, their sweet fragrance mixing with the ancient smell of wood polish and stone. James stood at the altar, his hands clasped before him, that characteristic smile playing on his lips. The one that had first captured Emma's heart during a chance encounter at the village bookshop 2 years ago. Margaret took her seat in the front row, her movements mechanical, rehearsed. Beside her, James's Aunt Patricia whispered excitedly about the reception preparations, oblivious to Margaret's inner turmoil. Every word felt distant, muffled, as if Margaret were underwater. She watched her son adjusting his boutonniere, laughing with his best man Tom, and her heart broke a little more. He had no idea. He'd lived his entire life not knowing. The organist began the processional, those familiar notes floating through the vaulted ceiling. Margaret's hand involuntarily moved to her handbag, feeling the envelope's edges through the fabric. Her late husband Richard's words echoed in her mind. "I was a coward, Maggie. I couldn't bear to lose you both, so I kept silent. James isn't my biological son, but he is my son in every way that matters. The truth is, he's..." The congregation rose as little flower girls began their walk, scattering rose petals. Behind them, Sarah appeared, her smile radiant. Then the music swelled, and Emma emerged on her father's arm. She was breathtaking, a vision of joy and innocence that made Margaret's decision even more agonizing. How could she destroy this moment? How could she not? Emma's eyes found James immediately, and the love between them was palpable. The congregation collectively sighed at the beauty of it. But as Emma passed Margaret's pew, their eyes met again, and Emma's step faltered slightly. Margaret's face was streaked with silent tears, her lips moving in what looked like a prayer or perhaps an apology. Reverend Morrison, who had baptized both Emma and James, began the ceremony with his warm, familiar voice. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Margaret's breathing became shallow. Each word brought them closer to the moment of no return. The envelope seemed to burn through her handbag. "Marriage is a sacred bond," the Reverend continued, "built on trust, honesty, and love." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. She thought of Richard, of the lie they'd lived for over 30 years. She thought of Emma's parents, David and Carol, sitting just behind her, blissfully unaware that their daughter was about to marry her own. If anyone knows of any lawful impediment why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The church fell silent. Margaret's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain everyone could hear it. James turned slightly, catching his mother's eye, and smiled that gentle smile that reminded her so much of his biological father. Time seemed to stop. Margaret's legs moved without conscious thought. She stood, her voice barely a whisper. "Reverend Morrison, I need a word." The congregation stirred, confused murmurs rippling through the pews like wind through wheat. James's smile froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. Emma's bouquet trembled in her hands, white roses quivering like her voice. "Margaret, please," Margaret said, stronger now, approaching the altar with the envelope clutched to her chest. "Reverend, I must speak with you, privately, now." The elderly minister's face shifted from confusion to concern. He'd known Margaret for 40 years. She wasn't given to dramatics. James stepped forward. "Mum, what are you doing? Whatever this is, it can wait." "No, my darling boy, it cannot." Margaret's voice broke on the last word. She turned to the Reverend, pressing the envelope into his hands. "Please read this, before another word is spoken. Please." The Reverend looked between the couple and Margaret, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess. If the wedding party would join me in the vestry." Emma's father stood, his protective instincts flaring. "Margaret, what is the meaning of this? You're frightening my daughter." Margaret turned to David Thornton then, and the look in her eyes made him step back. "David, Carol, I'm so sorry. I only found out 3 days ago. I've been in hell trying to decide, but I couldn't let them. I couldn't." In the vestry, the Reverend's face paled as he read. His hands began to shake. He looked up at Margaret, then at Emma and James, who stood side by side, their confusion morphing into dread. "Dear God," he whispered, is this verified?" Margaret nodded, pulling out additional documents. "DNA test results, medical records. My husband, Richard, he knew all along. He knew and said nothing." She turned to James, her son, her everything. "Your biological father isn't Richard, my love. It's David Thornton." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's bouquet hit the floor, roses scattering like broken promises. David Thornton staggered backward, his face draining of all color. "That's impossible. Margaret, we never..." "The conference in London. March, 33 years ago. Richard was supposed to go with me but fell ill. You drove me instead. The storm. The hotel had only one room left. We'd both had too much wine at dinner." Margaret's voice was hollow, speaking words she'd only just learned herself from Richard's letter. "We agreed never to speak of it. You loved Carol. I loved Richard. But Richard found out when James needed blood work as a child. He did a DNA test in secret." James stood frozen, his world reshaping itself with every word. Emma had backed away from him, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. They weren't just lovers about to be married, they were half-siblings. "No," James said, his voice rough. "No, this is some mistake. Dad would have told me. You would have known. Your father, Richard, loved you more than life itself. He couldn't bear the thought of losing you, of you thinking less of him. And I never suspected, never, until I found his letter. The vestry walls seemed to close in as the truth settled over them like ash from a burned world. Carol Thornton was the first to break, a sound escaping her that was part sob, part scream. She looked at her husband of 35 years as if seeing a stranger. "David, tell me she's lying. Tell me this is some terrible mistake." David's legs gave way and he collapsed onto a wooden bench, his head in his hands. "Carol, it was one night. One terrible, wonderful, horrible night. We swore it meant nothing. We were both so drunk, so lonely. I never knew. Margaret, I swear to God, I never knew James was my brother." Emma's voice cracked like thunder through the small room. "My fiancé is my brother." She turned to James, who reached for her instinctively before realizing the new boundary between them. Invisible, but insurmountable. His hand fell to his side, empty. Outside, the congregation grew restless. Sarah peered through the vestry door, her face etched with concern. "Is everything all right? People are starting to worry." She stopped mid-sentence, taking in the devastation written on every face. "Oh my God, what's happened?" The Reverend, recovering his composure, spoke gently but firmly. "The ceremony cannot proceed. There's been a family matter has come to light that makes this union impossible." He looked at Emma and James with profound sadness. "I'm so terribly sorry." James suddenly came alive, grabbing the documents from the Reverend's hands, scanning them desperately for some error, some sign of forgery. But the letterhead was authentic, the DNA markers undeniable. His father's, Richard's, handwriting unmistakable. "All this time," he whispered, "every birthday, every Father's Day, every moment was a lie?" Margaret reached for her son, but he recoiled. "Don't! Just don't!" He looked at David then. This man he'd known his whole life as Emma's father, the jovial baker who'd taught him to fly fish, who'd welcomed him into their family with such warmth. "Did you suspect? Even once?" David raised his tear-stained face. "Never." "James, you have to believe me. You look nothing like me. You were so much like Richard in manner and spirit. I never imagined." Emma had sunk to the floor, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled milk. Sarah knelt beside her, holding her as she shook with silent sobs. "All those times," Emma whispered, "all those moments when something felt so familiar about you, so comfortable, like I'd known you forever. It's because we share blood. Oh God, I think I'm going to be sick." Carol stood rigid, her voice ice. "Everyone out, everyone except David, now!" Her tone brooked no argument. Margaret gathered James. The Reverend ushered Emma and Sarah toward another exit. As they left, they could hear Carol's voice rising, 35 years of trust, detonating in accusations and anguish. In the churchyard, word had somehow spread. The congregation was dispersing in confusion and whispered speculation. Emma's cousins, James's colleagues, their university friends, all watching as the fairy tale crumbled. Someone had already started taking down the reception decorations at the village hall, white ribbons falling like surrender flags. 3 hours had passed since the revelation that shattered 2 families. Emma remained frozen in her childhood bedroom, still wearing the wedding dress that now felt like a shroud. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, creating patterns on the floor that reminded her of the rose petals she should have walked upon as Mrs. Hartwell. Instead, she sat at the edge of her bed, her sister Sarah beside her, both women suspended in a grief too complex for tears alone. "Do you know what the cruelest part is?" Emma's voice emerged hoarse, broken by hours of sobbing. "It's that my body doesn't understand. My heart still races when I think of him. My skin still remembers his touch. Every cell in my body is screaming that he's the one, that we belong together, and I have to consciously remind myself that we share blood, that what feels like destiny is actually disaster." Sarah held her sister tighter, her own tears falling silently. "Em, I don't know what to say. I keep thinking this is some nightmare, that we'll wake up and you'll still be walking down that aisle." She paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "I watched you two together. The way you looked at each other, the way you moved in sync without trying, it was like watching two halves of the same soul. How could something that beautiful be wrong? Because it is wrong, Emma said firmly, though her voice shook. We're siblings, Sarah. Half-siblings, but siblings nonetheless. Every kiss, every intimate moment, every time we made love. She shuddered violently. I feel sick. Not because of him, God help me, I still love him, but because of what we didn't know we were doing. Downstairs, the house reverberated with a different kind of anguish. Carol Thornton's voice, usually so warm and welcoming, had turned to ice. David sat at the kitchen table, the same table where James had asked for Emma's hand just 8 months ago, his head buried in his hands as his wife of 35 years paced like a caged animal. How many times? Carol's voice cut through the air. How many times did you look at that boy, at James, and not see yourself in him? His eyes, David, he has your eyes. How did I never notice? How did you never notice? Carol, please. David's voice was barely a whisper. It was one night, one terrible mistake 33 years ago. We were both drunk, both grieving. Stop. Carol's hand slammed on the table, making the wedding favors they'd assembled just yesterday jump and scatter. Don't you dare minimize this. You didn't just betray me that night. You betrayed me every single day since, by not telling me there was even a possibility that James could be yours. Every family dinner, every Christmas, every time that boy came to court our daughter, you let it happen. I didn't know! David's voice cracked with desperation. Carol, I swear on my mother's grave I never suspected. Richard was his father in every way. James looks like Margaret, acts like Richard. There was nothing of me in him that I could see. Except his blood, Carol said coldly. Except the DNA that makes him our Emma's brother. Meanwhile, across the village, James stood alone in the empty church, having returned after everyone had fled in shock and confusion. The altar flowers seemed to mock him with their pristine beauty, untouched by the devastation that had unfolded before them. Margaret found him there an hour later, sitting in the exact spot where he should have been saying his vows. The ring is still in my pocket, he said without looking at his mother. Emma's wedding ring. I designed it myself, you know. Had it engraved with the coordinates of where we first met, right outside this church, actually. She was arranging flowers for Easter service, and I was visiting you. She had dirt on her nose and smiled at me like sunshine. His voice broke. How is it possible that my soulmate is my sister? Margaret sat down beside him, maintaining the distance he seemed to need. James, I need you to understand something. Richard, your father, because he was your father, loved you more than life itself. This secret he kept, it was wrong, but it came from love. Love? James laughed bitterly. Love would have been telling me the truth. Love would have been preventing me from falling for my own half-sister. Do you have any idea what it feels like to discover that the person you've built your entire future around, the person you've been intimate with in every possible way, shares your blood? It's not just losing Emma, it's losing myself. Everything I thought I knew about who I am is a lie. At that moment, James's phone buzzed with messages from friends, colleagues, distant relatives who'd heard fragments of the story. The news was spreading through their social circles like wildfire. He turned off his phone, unable to face the questions, the shock, the pity that would follow. I need to see him, James said suddenly. David, my father. The word tasted foreign, wrong. I need to understand how this happened. The meeting took place in neutral territory, the small cafe at the edge of town where tourists rarely ventured. David arrived first, looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 hours. When James walked in, both men froze, seeing each other with new eyes. The resemblance, once you looked for it, was undeniable. The same strong jaw, the same way of holding their shoulders when tense, the same habit of running their hand through their hair when distressed. I loved your mother, David began, then corrected himself. I love Carol. Margaret and I. It was a moment of weakness that should never have happened. Tell me about that night, James demanded. I need to know everything." David closed his eyes, remembering. "Your mother, Margaret, had just lost her mother. She was devastated. Richard was supposed to accompany her to the medical conference in London, but he came down with flu at the last minute. He asked me to drive her, make sure she was all right. I was going through my own grief. My father was dying of cancer. We were both so lost, James. After the conference, we went for drinks. One drink became many. The hotel had a booking error, only one room available. We should have found another hotel, but the storm that night was terrible, and we were both too drunk to drive anywhere. And then," James's voice was steel, "and then we made a mistake that we both regretted immediately. The next morning, we couldn't even look at each other. We swore it would never be mentioned again, that it meant nothing. I loved Carol desperately. Margaret loved Richard. We agreed it was grief and alcohol, nothing more. When Margaret announced her pregnancy a month later, I assumed Richard was her husband. The timing fit. There was no reason to suspect, except there was," James interrupted. "Somewhere in your mind you must have wondered." David met his eyes then, man to man. Maybe I chose not to wonder because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. And watching you grow up, you were so clearly Richard's son in every way that mattered. He taught you to ride a bike, to tie a tie, to be a good man. I was just the neighbor, the friend, Emma's father. 6 weeks had passed since the wedding that never was, and Bourton-on-the-Water had slowly stopped holding its collective breath. The initial scandal that had ripped through the village like a summer storm had settled into an uncomfortable quiet, the kind that fell whenever any member of the two families appeared in public. The tea-room conversations would halt mid-sentence, the post office queue would part silently, and even the children seemed to sense that Emma Thornton no longer smiled the way she used to. Emma had returned to teaching after 2 weeks, despite everyone encouraging her to take more time. But the classroom was her sanctuary, the one place where she could lose herself in something pure and untainted. Her Year 3 students didn't know why Miss Thornton seemed sadder, why her laughter didn't quite reach her eyes anymore, but they sensed her need for their innocent affection and gave it freely. Little Lucy Morrison, the Reverend's granddaughter, brought her flowers every Monday, wild daisies picked from the churchyard where Emma should have been married. "Miss Thornton," Lucy said one afternoon, "my gran says sometimes God gives us hard tests to make us stronger. Are you having a hard test?" Emma knelt down to the child's level, accepting the slightly wilted bouquet. "Yes, sweetheart, a very hard test. Will you pass it?" Emma felt tears threaten, but managed a genuine smile. "I'm trying my very best." The cottage Emma and James had bought together stood empty on Riverside Lane, a monument to a future that would never be. Emma had gone there only once, with Sarah's support, to collect her personal belongings. The walls were still painted the soft sage green they'd chosen together. The kitchen still held the copper pots they'd bought at an antique fair in Stow-on-the-Wold. In what would have been the nursery, she found James's architectural drawings for the garden renovation. He'd designed a play area, sketching in stick figures of children that would never exist. James had taken extended leave from his law firm in London, unable to concentrate on other people's legal problems when his own life had become a case study in cruel irony. He'd moved back to Margaret's cottage, but the walls felt like they were closing in. Every corner held a memory of Emma. The kitchen where she'd taught him to make proper scones, the living room where they'd planned their honeymoon to the Amalfi Coast, the garden bench where he'd first told her he loved her. He'd started running at dawn, pushing his body to exhaustion in hopes his mind would follow suit. One morning, he encountered David on the same path along the river. Both men stopped, uncertain of the protocol for meeting one's newly discovered biological father, who was also the father of the woman you could never have. "James," David said quietly, "how are you holding up?" "I'm not," James replied with brutal honesty. "I wake up every morning for about 3 seconds of peace before I remember. Then it hits me all over again. Emma is my sister. You're my father. The man who raised me knew all along my entire life is built on lies." David winced. "Not lies, James. Richard loved you truly. That wasn't a lie. But it was a lie by omission. Do you know what I found out yesterday? My blood type. I needed medical records for the leave paperwork, and there it was. I'm AB positive. Richard was O negative. Margaret is a positive. It's genetically impossible for me to be his biological son. Any first-year medical student would have caught it. He knew, and he chose to say nothing. He chose to be your father, David said carefully. That's not nothing. No, but it took away my choice, Emma's choice. If we'd known, James trailed off, then his voice hardened. We would never have met at that Easter service. We would never have fallen in love. We would never have made love in the bed we bought together, planning the children we'd have, choosing names. His voice broke entirely. The two men stood in the morning mist, the river flowing beside them carrying leaves and twigs toward an unseen destination, much like their lives had been carrying them toward this moment of revelation. In the Thornton household, the aftermath had taken a different shape. Carol and David were sleeping in separate bedrooms, going through the motions of maintaining their bakery business while their personal life crumbled. Carol's trust, once broken, seemed impossible to rebuild. She found herself questioning every moment of their marriage, every friendship with the Hartwells, every interaction that now seemed tainted with deception. I look at our wedding photos, she told her sister Patricia during one of many tear-filled phone calls, and I wonder what else was a lie. What other secrets has he kept? He swears it was just that once. But how can I believe him? He let our daughter fall in love with his son. His son, Patricia. Margaret had perhaps the heaviest burden of all. Not only had she lost the life she'd known, her son could barely look at her. Her community regarded her with a mixture of pity and scandal. But she also carried the unique grief of a mother watching her child suffer in a way she was powerless to fix. She'd started attending a support group in Oxford, driving the hour each way to sit with strangers and speak the unspeakable. "My son is in love with his half-sister," she said during one session, the words still surreal. They didn't grow up as siblings. They met as adults, fell genuinely in love, and were about to marry when I discovered the truth. I had to destroy my son's happiness to save him from an even greater horror. Children born of incest, a marriage that would have been legally void, a love that society would condemn. The facilitator, a kind woman named Dr. Hughes, asked gently, "How do you cope with being the bearer of such devastating truth?" Margaret considered the question. "I don't know if I am coping. I did the right thing, I know that. But the right thing has destroyed everyone I love. My son looks at me like I'm a stranger. The man who raised him as his own is gone, unable to explain or defend his choices. David and Carol's marriage might not survive. And Emma, that lovely girl who should have been my daughter-in-law, is now my son's forbidden love. How does one cope with that?" The secret had rippled outward, affecting even peripheral relationships. Emma's best friend from university, Chloe, had come to visit, trying to provide support, but even she struggled with the unprecedented situation. I don't know what to say," Chloe admitted over tea in Emma's garden. "When someone's boyfriend cheats, I know what to say. When someone has a death in the family, I know what to do. But this, your fiancé turning out to be your brother, there's no playbook for this." "I know," Emma said quietly. "I've Googled it, you know. In love with half-sibling, accidental incest, genetic sexual attraction. There are support groups, apparently, other people this has happened to. But reading their stories doesn't help. It just confirms what I already know. The love doesn't just go away because you discover you're related. 1 year later, spring breathed life back into the Cotswolds, painting hope across hills that had witnessed so much heartbreak." Emma stood in her classroom, reading to her students, with a voice that no longer trembled. The children didn't know their teacher carried a love that could never be, only that she understood sadness in a way that made them feel safe with their own tears. Thomas Ashford had entered her life gently, like morning mist. A fellow teacher from Cheltenham, he'd recognized the grief she carried and hadn't tried to fix it. "We all have ghosts," he'd said simply. "The brave ones learn to dance with them." In Edinburgh, James had built a different life, channeling his pain into purpose. His law practice focused on adoption cases, fighting for the transparency that might prevent other families from shattering as his had. The irony wasn't lost on him, saving strangers from the fate that had claimed his own happiness. His flat overlooked the ancient castle, and on sleepless nights he'd stand watching its enduring stones, thinking of Emma. She existed in every sunrise, every legal brief about family truth, every woman he couldn't quite love because his heart remained in Bourton-on-the-Water with his impossible beloved. The four parents had found their own paths to healing. Margaret and David met monthly, not as former lovers, but as James's biological parents, bound by shared grief and guilt. Their single night of weakness had created a life, James, and destroyed two others, his and Emma's future together. "Does he seem at peace?" Margaret would ask, having visited James in his exile. "Surviving," David would answer, the word heavy with all it didn't say. Carol and David's marriage had survived through brutal honesty and painful counseling. They'd sold the bakery, moved to Chipping Campden, close enough to stay in Emma's life, but far enough to escape the whispers. Trust, once shattered, had been rebuilt grain by grain, like sand becoming glass through fire. It was Sarah who orchestrated what she called the gathering, not a reunion, but an acknowledgement. They met at a cottage in Chipping Norton, neutral ground for impossible conversations. Emma and James arrived separately, maintaining careful distance while allowing themselves to share air for the first time in months. "You cut your hair," James said, his voice carrying a year of unspoken words. "You grew a beard," Emma managed, her smile fragile as spring ice. They stood parallel on the terrace, looking outward because looking at each other might shatter their carefully constructed composure. The love between them hummed like electricity, dangerous and undeniable. "I'm seeing someone," Emma whispered. "Thomas, he's kind." James nodded, each word a stone in his chest. "You deserve kindness." "I'm not happy," she admitted, "but I'm trying." He understands he's getting someone whose heart belongs elsewhere. "Emma," James turned, breaking his own rule about eye contact. "Don't," she breathed. "My heart doesn't care that you're my half-brother. It still chooses you. It will always choose you." Inside, Margaret watched them through the window, tears sliding silently. "They're still in love," she said. "They always will be," Carol replied, surprising herself with compassion. "That kind of love doesn't die because it's forbidden. It just transforms into something you carry forever." Before leaving, James pulled out a small box. "Your wedding ring. I designed it with the coordinates where we met. I can't keep it. Can't throw it away." Emma took it with trembling fingers. "I'll plant a tree. Something beautiful growing from something that had to die." 2 years later, Emma married Thomas in Cheltenham, a quiet ceremony of second chances. James found companionship with a fellow lawyer who understood that some wounds never heal. They built lives that looked whole from outside, had children who would never know their forbidden cousins, created happiness that was real, if incomplete. But in the secret chambers of their hearts, they remained eternally connected. The apple tree Emma planted in Bourton-on-the-Water, nourished by the buried ring, blooms magnificently each spring. Locals admire its beauty, not knowing it's a memorial to perfect love made impossible by truth. Sometimes Emma visits the tree. Twice she's found evidence James has been there, a white stone placed with precision, like a prayer or promise. They never speak of these visits, these pilgrimages to what might have been. Richard's letter, worn soft in James's pocket, held the only wisdom that mattered. Love isn't diminished by circumstance. You found real love. That it cannot be sustained doesn't diminish its value. Live fully. That's how you honor all of us who love you. The truth hadn't freed them conventionally, but it taught them that some loves transcend even the cruelest revelations, not because they can be lived, but because they existed at all. Emma and James loved with a purity that even forbidden blood couldn't taint. Their story ends not with joy, but with grace, not with union, but with understanding that true love sometimes means letting go. In Bourton-on-the-Water, two hearts beat separately that once beat as one, carrying a love that death itself couldn't kill because it was never truly allowed to live.